I'm leaving.
I told you, this is how it has to be. There's nothing left to discuss.
Goodbye.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Please subscribe, like, and share. Your support helps. Now, let's get into the story.
Terrence stood at the bottom of my staircase with a single-pack suitcase, straightening his jacket in the reflection of the same floor-to-ceiling mirror I'd installed myself 8 years earlier, back when this house was still just blueprints and a company I hadn't sold yet.
I'm leaving.
I'm leaving, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. Bianca and I are serious. I think it's time we both just be honest about where this marriage actually stands. I stood at the top of the stairs, one hand resting on the banister, and I felt something in me go very quiet and very still. Not devastation exactly, though I understand that's what he expected. Something closer to a strange, clarifying calm. The specific sensation of finally hearing out loud a truth I'd suspected for months. How long? I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. Does it matter? He said, checking his watch instead of answering directly. Look, I'll have my lawyer reach out about next steps. You're not my wife anymore, Camille. I don't think we need to make this harder than it already is. I want you to sit with that sentence the way I had to sit with it. Standing at the top of a staircase in a $90 million home, he'd walked into 8 years ago with a single duffel bag, and a job that paid considerably less than the interior designer I'd hired to select our light fixtures. My name is Camille Rhodes, and I built the company that made this house possible from a laptop in a one-bedroom apartment, 5 years before I ever met Terrence at all. Every deed, every title, every single asset inside these walls belonged to me, solely, long before he ever learned my last name. Before I tell you exactly what happened 40 minutes after he walked out that front door with his suitcase, because the specific look on his face when he tried to come back inside is something I will remember for the rest of my life. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because I promise you, this story does not end where Terrence assumed it would. He walked past me down the stairs, past the foyer, out through the front door, suitcase wheels clicking against the marble I'd chosen myself. Years before I'd ever considered sharing this house with anyone at all. I had no idea, watching that door close behind him, exactly how quickly he was about to learn precisely whose name was actually on every document that mattered. Or exactly how differently the rest of that afternoon was about to unfold compared to whatever version of leaving he'd rehearsed in his head. I want to take you back to a one-bedroom apartment in Austin, 5 years before I ever met Terrence, because understanding exactly what I'd already built before he entered my life matters enormously to understanding exactly why that front door closed so completely behind him. I founded Rhodes Analytics at 26, a data infrastructure company built initially on nothing more than a laptop, 3 years of unpaid nights after my day job, and a stubborn belief that the specific problem I was solving mattered enough to bet my entire savings account on. I want to be honest about how unglamorous those early years actually were. Eating instant noodles for months at a time, sleeping 4 hours a night, watching 2 different co-founders leave when the runway got too thin for them to stay. I want to walk you through the specific moments that mattered most during those early years, because I think it's important that anyone listening understands this wasn't inherited money or a lucky break. I remember the exact night, 3 years in, when our largest early client nearly walked away over a missed deadline, and I stayed awake for 36 consecutive hours personally rewriting the core piece of software that saved that contract, and with it, the entire company. By year 4, Rhodes Analytics had grown into a genuinely significant player in supply chain data infrastructure, profitable, growing, attracting acquisition interest from considerably larger competitors. I sold the company at 29 years old, in a deal that made headlines in industry publications, for an amount that, once taxes and reinvestment were accounted for, left me with considerably more financial security than I'd ever imagined possible growing up in a modest household outside Houston. I want to walk you through why the mansion itself mattered so much to me, beyond simply its price tag. I designed nearly every element of that house myself, over 18 months, working directly with an architect to build something that reflected exactly what those exhausting years of building a company from nothing had actually meant to me. A home that felt, in every square foot, like proof that the sacrifice had been worth it. I purchased the land and began construction 2 full years before I ever met Terrence, meaning the house itself, along with the vast majority of my remaining wealth, existed entirely independent of our eventual marriage, structured, by my own attorney's careful advice, in a way that protected it as separate property regardless of whatever came later. I met Terrence at a mutual friend's dinner party roughly 8 months after the mansion's completion. Drawn initially to his easy charm and the specific attentiveness he showed me during a period when most of the men I met seemed considerably more interested in my bank account than in me directly. I want to be honest that our early marriage felt genuinely good, for the first several years. Terrence worked in commercial insurance sales, a comfortable but modest income compared to my own resources, though I never once made him feel small about that disparity, believing genuinely that a marriage's foundation should rest on considerably more than matched income. I had no idea, in those early years, exactly how much that comfort would eventually calcify into something considerably less attractive. An entitlement that grew, slowly and then all at once, until Terrence seemed to forget entirely that the extraordinary life we shared had never actually been built by him at all. I want to walk you through the specific season things began shifting in our marriage, because I think the slow, incremental nature of Terrence's growing entitlement mattered enormously to understanding how genuinely blindsided I initially felt by his eventual betrayal. It started subtly, roughly 3 years into our marriage, with small comments at dinner parties that I initially brushed off as harmless exaggeration. Terrence describing our company, when discussing Rhodes Analytics' eventual sale, despite having had no involvement whatsoever in building it. I remember correcting him gently the first several times, and I remember, too, the specific flicker of irritation that crossed his face each time I did, as though my correction diminished him somehow rather than simply stating an obvious fact. By year 5, he'd stopped working entirely, a decision he framed to me as wanting to focus on our family's future together, though I want to be honest that this framing felt, even at the time, like a convenient justification for a lifestyle he'd grown considerably too comfortable inhabiting without contributing anything toward maintaining it. I want to give you specific examples, because I think vague descriptions of entitlement don't capture how genuinely insidious it becomes over time. Terrence began making unilateral decisions about renovations to the house, ordering custom furniture and structural changes without consulting me first, despite the house existing entirely as my separate property. When I gently pushed back once, reminding him these were significant financial decisions about a home legally in my name alone, he told me I was being unnecessarily territorial about something that belongs to both of us as a married couple. I want to be honest that I let that particular comment go uncorrected for longer than I probably should have, exhausted by the specific friction of constantly having to assert boundaries around wealth I'd built entirely myself, within a marriage that was supposed to feel like partnership rather than ongoing negotiation. Roughly 18 months before that afternoon with his packed suitcase, I noticed Terrence's attention drifting in ways that felt familiar to anyone who's watched a marriage slowly hollow out from the inside. Longer unexplained absences, a phone that never left his hand, a specific new attentiveness to his own appearance that hadn't been there in years. I confronted him gently about it on more than one occasion, and each time, he offered some version of reassurance carrying a specific, practiced smoothness I would later recognize as rehearsed rather than genuine. "You're imagining things," he told me once. "I think you're just used to being in control of everything and it makes you suspicious when you're not." I learned about Bianca roughly 4 months before that final afternoon, through a friend who'd seen Terrence at a restaurant across town with a woman considerably younger than either of us, seated in the kind of easy intimacy that leaves very little room for alternate explanation. I confronted him directly that time, and I want to be honest about his response, because it revealed exactly the entitlement that had been quietly building for years. "Maybe if you hadn't spent our entire marriage making me feel like a guest in my own house," he said, "I wouldn't have needed to look somewhere else for something that actually felt like mine." I had no idea, absorbing that particular deflection, exactly how completely Terrence had convinced himself that my own hard-won success was somehow the reason he felt entitled to betray me. or exactly how differently he was about to understand his own position in this marriage once he actually attempted to walk away from it. You already witnessed the core of that final exchange. Terrence's suitcase, his flat announcement that Bianca and he were serious, the specific cruelty of, "You're not my wife anymore," delivered while standing in a house he'd never once contributed toward building. I want to walk you through what happened in the 40 minutes immediately following his departure, because those 40 minutes mattered enormously to everything that came after. I want to be honest about what I felt watching that front door close behind him. Not devastation, though I understand that's what most people might expect. Something closer to a clean, decisive clarity. The specific relief of finally being released from years of quietly managing someone else's growing sense of entitlement toward a life I'd built entirely on my own. I called my attorney within 10 minutes of Terrence's departure, a woman named Patricia Alvarez who'd handled my company's sale years earlier, and had drafted the specific property protections surrounding the mansion from the very beginning of my marriage. "He's moved out," I told her. "I want the locks changed today, and I want you to confirm exactly what he does and doesn't have any legal claim to." Patricia confirmed, within the hour, exactly what I already understood clearly. The mansion, along with the substantial majority of my remaining assets, existed entirely as my separate property, protected by a prenuptial agreement Terrence had signed willingly, if somewhat reluctantly, 8 years earlier, along with the simple legal fact that the property had been purchased and titled solely in my name years before our marriage even began. I want to walk you through the specific, deliberate satisfaction of watching a locksmith change every exterior lock on that house within 3 hours of Terrence's departure, replacing not just the front door but every entry point he'd previously had access to, ensuring completely that whatever version of "we'll figure out logistics later" he'd assumed was coming simply wasn't going to happen. Terrence returned that same evening, roughly 6 hours after his initial departure, apparently having realized somewhere during his afternoon with Bianca that he'd left behind several belongings he still needed. I watched, through my home's security camera system, his specific confusion when his key card no longer activated the front gate at all. He called my cell phone immediately, his voice carrying a considerably different tone than the flat confidence he'd used walking out that morning. "Camille, my key isn't working. I still need to grab some things. You made it very clear this morning that I'm not your wife anymore," I said calmly, watching his expression on the camera feed shift from confusion into something closer to genuine alarm. "Which means legally, you're no longer entitled to access a property that has never once belonged to you in the first place. My attorney will coordinate a time for you to collect your personal belongings under appropriate supervision." I had no idea, delivering that particular line, exactly how thoroughly it was about to reshape Terrence's understanding of the position he'd actually occupied in this marriage all along. Nor did I know exactly how quickly his confidence from that morning was about to fully collapse once the actual legal reality of his situation became undeniable. I want to walk you through the weeks that followed, because Terrence's specific unraveling, once the legal reality of his situation became clear, revealed considerably more about the actual foundation of his confidence than anything that had happened during our marriage itself. Terrence hired his own attorney within days, attempting to argue some version of entitlement to spousal support or a claim against the mansion's value, despite the prenuptial agreement he'd signed at the very beginning of our marriage. I want to be honest that this attempt collapsed almost immediately. Patricia's documentation was thorough. The prenuptial agreement had been reviewed independently by Terrence's own attorney at the time of signing, and the mansion's ownership history predated our marriage by nearly 2 full years, leaving essentially no legal ground for any meaningful challenge. His attorney advised him, within 2 weeks, that pursuing the matter further would cost considerably more in legal fees than any realistic outcome could possibly justify. I learned, through mutual acquaintances, that Bianca's own enthusiasm for the relationship cooled considerably once the practical reality of Terrence's actual financial position became clear to her. No house, no substantial assets of his own. A lifestyle that had, for 8 years, existed entirely as a reflection of my success rather than anything he'd built independently. I don't feel particular satisfaction learning this, though I understand why some listening might expect me to. I've found mostly a quiet clarity about exactly what Bianca had actually been attracted to in the first place. A lifestyle Terrence himself had never actually built, and therefore had no real ability to offer her once separated from the woman who had. The divorce itself finalized roughly 5 months after that afternoon with the suitcase, considerably faster and more straightforward than most divorces involving assets of this scale, given the thorough legal protections I'd established years before Terrence and I ever met. He received a modest settlement, considerably more generous than he was legally entitled to, which I offered not out of any lingering obligation, but simply because I believed, even amid genuine anger, in extending more grace than the situation strictly required. I want to be honest about something I've thought about often since the divorce finalized. My own role, if any, in allowing Terrence's entitlement to grow as thoroughly as it did over 8 years. I don't believe I caused his betrayal, and I want to be clear about that. But I do believe, looking back honestly, that I let small moments of overreach go uncorrected for far too long, out of a desire to avoid friction in a marriage I genuinely wanted to work. I had no idea, sitting with that honest reflection in the months following the divorce, exactly how much clearer my own boundaries would become in whatever relationships followed. Nor did I know exactly how much peace I would eventually find in a house that had, once again, become entirely and simply my own. It's been just over a year now since that afternoon on the staircase, and I want to give you an honest account of where things actually stand, rather than a tidier resolution than real life usually offers. I've since founded a second company, a smaller, more focused venture capital fund specifically supporting early-stage founders who remind me considerably of who I was in that one-bedroom apartment all those years ago. Exhausted, underestimated, and entirely capable of building something extraordinary if given genuine support rather than dismissal. I've rebuilt my life in that same mansion, though I've made a point, in the year since, of changing small details throughout the house that once carried Terrence's presence. Not out of lingering bitterness, but simply as a quiet, deliberate act of reclaiming a space that had always, legally and emotionally, been entirely mine. I've thought often, over this past year, about the specific, slow way entitlement takes root in a relationship when boundaries go unenforced for too long. I don't believe Terrence set out, from the very beginning of our marriage, intending to eventually betray me. I believe, instead, that 8 years of unchecked comfort within a life he hadn't built himself slowly convinced him he'd somehow earned a claim to it regardless. A belief that only fully collapsed once the actual legal and financial reality of his position became undeniable. If you've ever built something entirely on your own, only to watch someone grow comfortable enough within your success to eventually believe they were entitled to it, I want you to hear this clearly. Comfort is not the same thing as ownership, and shared lifestyle is not the same thing as shared assets. However thoroughly someone convinces themselves otherwise over enough years of unchallenged entitlement. Protecting what you've built isn't cruelty. It's simply clarity, applied at exactly the moment someone finally reveals how little they actually understood about the foundation they'd been standing on the entire time. Terrence walked out of my house with a single suitcase, certain that 8 years of shared comfort gave him some meaningful claim to a life he'd never actually built. He had no idea, trying to walk back through that front gate a few hours later, exactly how quickly and completely he was about to learn precisely how wrong that assumption had always been.